Hi, I'm Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and I'd like to welcome you back to Profiles in Jewish History, the Lions of Zion series, and tonight we're going to discuss the life and times of Theodor Herzl. Now, by design, we did not start this series with Herzl. Many would have expected us to, because Herzl often gets the accolade as the father of modern Zionism. And considering in this series we're looking into the founders of modern Zionism, wouldn't it have made sense to start with the father of modern Zionism? So by design we didn't, because if you watch the previous lectures in these series, you'll see that when Herzl comes onto the scene, modern Zionism is in many ways already in full swing. It's already moving along. And he will add an element that we'll discuss, but as we discussed previously, the Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion, was in full swing. We already had Baron Rothschild, who was giving significant funds to build up the land of Israel. And into this world is the world that Herzl comes into. So if we want to say that modern Zionism really begins in the mid-19th century, Herzl does not come onto the scene till the tail end of the 19th century, to the late 1890s. Now, Herzl is a very central, I don't want to take it away from him, he is a very central figure in the Zionist movement, but in many ways an enigmatic figure. He's very much an unlikely hero. Today he gets the credit with maybe more than he deserves, maybe not, I'll let you decide after this lecture, but he is credited in many circles as being like a savior of the Jewish people, because he brought about the modern state of Israel. And after the Holocaust and after all the assimilation and the diaspora Jewry, like, we can think, where would we be today without the state of Israel? Whatever our views are on it religiously, we're not getting into, but it's a place where, because of the modern state of Israel, the majority of the world Jewish population has a home. Majority of the world Jewish population lives in that state, with many things that we would not have if we did not have a actual governmental state of the state of Israel. And we're going to see a lot of that credit is due to Herzl. So where would we be without it? Yeah, we're going to see he in many ways remains a mystery. Now, a lot of the reasons why he's such a hard figure to wrap our heads around and to understand and to figure out is because of where he comes from. He was born in Pest-Hungary in 1860 to an assimilated Jewish family. Now, this was not a generationally assimilated Jewish family, because this was about, let's say, not even 100 years into the quote-unquote Enlightenment, the Haskalah of Western Europe, but he was one generation removed. As a matter of fact, his grandfather was an Orthodox rabbi, but his father was the one who already left traditional Judaism, became disconnected from traditional Judaism, and that's how he raised Herzl. Now, Herzl was raised with a little bit. He was, according to most accounts, given a bris milah at his birth. He was circumcised. He was given a Hebrew name at his birth, Binyamin Zev, which he never used until later at the beginning of the Zionist movement, when he started to use the name, when he learned Hebrew and started to use the name. But beyond many of these things, he was raised totally secular, probably didn't know Hebrew till his later years, probably didn't observe many of the commandments of the Torah. It's not like he didn't have exposure, because in Budapest he lived next door to the Doheny Street Synagogue, so he definitely saw religious Jews in his life, but was definitely something that he was not brought up with, with much Jewish involvement at all. Now, his training was as a lawyer, but he had a very unsuccessful law career and ended up turning to writing, which was really his area of, we'll say, where he wanted to be, where he found his groove in life. And he became a journalist and a playwright, and became a journalist for a paper called the New Free Press, the New Free World, which was really the paper of note in Vienna, is where he lived at this point. He lived in Vienna, Austria. And it was the paper of note. So he was one of the main journalists for one of the main papers of his time, and he was a playwright of note. When people would interact with him, he was a famous name. He was a famous name as a journalist, a famous name of a playwright. It's not like he came from nowhere. When Herzl comes onto the scene, people already know the name Theodor Herzl. Not associated with anything Jewish. They know him as a journalist. They know him as a playwright, not with anything Jewish. So you can understand where this comes from, that someone who maybe people didn't even know he was Jewish, but he was known as a successful writer, and he starts talking about these ideas of Zionism, people think it's gone meshuggah. Because, like, okay, yesterday you were the noted playwright and the noted journalist and all that, and all of a sudden you're talking about these topics of Jews returning to the land of Israel, building a state. Like, did you fall on your head? That's almost the world that Herzl will come into as the leader of the Zionist movement. Now, where does it come from? Where's the spark, so to speak, come from? It's well documented that the spark that, so to speak, lit Herzl as becoming enamored with, turning his attention to, we'll call it the Jewish question, the Jewish problem. Obviously, we're not referring to the later Jewish problem, the Jewish question of the Nazis, but the Jewish problem that we've already addressed in previous lectures in this series, that the Jewish world was already now 1,800 years in exile, and not only that, but the exile had turned very, very dark. We, again, know the darkest moments of our exile was for sure the Holocaust, the destruction of European Jewry, but it was plenty dark before that. Really, from, we'll say, the Cossack uprisings of the 17th century, until this point, it just had gotten progressively worse for the Jews of Eastern Europe. So even though Western Europe was becoming emancipated, Jews were getting certain freedoms and making it to high levels of society. In Eastern Europe, where they also tried to bring in these ideas of Haskalah and emancipation and enlightenment, it just didn't work. And we see that the Eastern Europe, which is Russia at this point, it's the Russian Empire, that is Eastern Europe. You have the May laws, you have all the anti-Semitism, and it's a problem. It's a problem that the Jewish world is dealing with, and it's leading to mass migration of Jews out of Russia. Now, what awoke Herzl to this issue? It was something that took place not in Eastern Europe, but things taking place in Western Europe, in the emancipated Western Europe, where Jews, so to speak, had freedoms, could go to university, could be part of society, could reach the highest levels of society. That's where he started to witness some of the same anti-Semitism that was driving the terrible predicament in Eastern Europe. And the event that he writes about the most was the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair took place in the wake of the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. Now, in the Franco-Prussian War, France was the world empire. This is really before Britain had come onto the scene as the major world empire that they were before World War I and definitely after World War I. France was the empire of the world at this point. And France goes to war with Prussia. Prussia was just before the German Empire. It was the largest state of Germany, what became the German Empire. And it was when Germany started to exert itself as a world power that will eventually lead to World War I and World War II. That Germany really exerting himself as a European power, that's what led us into World War I and World War II. I mean, a lot of things led us into it, but that was probably one of the main things that brought us to World War I and World War II. But the first, so to speak, battle in the great wars of World War I and World War II was really this Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And in 6 weeks, Prussia wins decisively. They humiliate France. France will go on to be humiliated by Germany many times, but this is the first of many times that France is humiliated by Germany, by Prussia. And it leads to 20 years of turmoil in France. So within France, they needed a scapegoat. They needed to blame this on someone. They said that, how could the great French army have been defeated by the upstart Prussian army? And the scapegoat became a Jew by the name of Alfred Dreyfus. Now, he was a likely scapegoat because, first of all, he was Jewish. Second of all, he was Alsatian. Alsatian was part of France that was always culturally German, and it was actually the part of France that Germany wanted in the Franco-Prussian War. It was the part that they wanted. They wanted Alsace and Lorraine, the two culturally German parts of France. That's what they wanted, that's what they got, and that's what they took. And that's the part of France that Dreyfus was from. So he was in the French General Staff, and because of that, got blamed for the defeat of the French and the Franco-Prussian War. Now, in truth, there was a spy. There were traitors. Esterhazy and Henri were their names, and they were the ones who were both working for the Germans. They gave the Germans all the plans for the war. So it is right that there was a spy, but it wasn't the Jew, the Alsatian French Jew Dreyfus. And there's really no evidence. The evidence was very weak, but nevertheless, in a trial that took place in 1894, he is found guilty. He's blamed for everything. He's court-martialed. He's sent to Devil's Isle, and eventually he'll get out. And he'll be expunged, and he'll be reinstated to the French army. And Dreyfus himself was a very unlikely hero in many ways. But the journalist sent by the New Free World from Vienna to cover this trial was none other than Theodor Herzl. And he covers the trial in Paris. And he sees in the trial that, first of all, he sees clearly it's not a fair trial. He sees clearly that Dreyfus is being scapegoated. But I don't know if that's what bothers him as much as the fact of the way that the Parisian masses respond to Dreyfus. They don't shout in the streets, "Death to Dreyfus." They don't shout in the streets, "Death to the traitor." They shout in the streets, "Death to the Jews." This, again, himself, Dreyfus was a secular Jew, the secular Jew who had served the French very well and, all this time. He is labeled as a Jew. The Jews are blamed for the loss of the Franco-Prussian War. And Herzl is shocked. Because the same anti-Semitism he had been hearing about from Russia, from Eastern Europe, exists here in Paris, the cultural capital of Western Europe, enlightened Paris, and this kind of anti-Semitism thrives, and it awakens something in Herzl. At least this is what he writes. Now, in truth, in Vienna, where he came from, there was plenty of anti-Semitism. The person who in 1897 is elected to be mayor of Vienna is someone by the name of Karl Lueger, who we would call nowadays a Nazi. Again, before the Nazi Party, but total out-and-out anti-Semite, who a lot of the things he promoted and he talked about were the same things that the Nazis would talk about 30 years later. So to say that Herzl had never seen anti-Semitism in Western Europe until he came to Paris and saw the Dreyfus affair, probably not the case. But as he writes, the Dreyfus affair is what awakened in him the severity and the gravity of this Jewish problem of anti-Semitism. Now, it's interesting that Herzl originally proposed mass conversion of the Jews to Christianity. He originally thought that the problem was Judaism, and he in fact wrote in his diary, and I quote, "In Paris, as I have seen, I achieved a free attitude toward anti-Semitism. I recognize the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism. I believe I understand anti-Semitism. I regard it as a consequence of the Jewish emancipation. I have an idea. The mass conversion of Jews to Christianity, not indeed to the dominant confession, I don't want to upset people's beliefs, but to a liberal free church. On a certain day, say Easter Sunday, the entire community would be baptized in a great ceremony." This was his original idea. He said the problem is Judaism. If the Jews would just abandon Judaism, say we aren't Jews anymore, then there wouldn't be anti-Semitism. He quickly came off this idea, but it's just always fascinating to point out that that's where he started. But then he came up with the concept that he said the reason that the non-Jews don't like us and that we have so much anti-Semitism in both Eastern and Western Europe is because we're so different. We're a nation in exile. We're a people in exile. But if we had a state with a flag, with the national anthem, with an army, with a real state culture, with the real culture of a country, then they'd leave us alone. Then we'd be like everyone else. So again, it's interesting that at a certain level, Herzl was promoting a certain amount of assimilation. That was his idea. Everyone else has a country, we should have a country. Everyone else has a flag, national anthem, we should have these things, and then they'll stop hating us. Now, it's always just so ironic to point out that much of Herzl's dream was achieved, right? There's a secular state with a national anthem, with a flag, with an army, with a culture, with an economy, and all these things. But it only exacerbated anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, as we know full well today with looking around, has only gotten worse in the world with the rise of the modern Jewish state. And even though they all try and blame it on, oh, it's the occupation, oh, it's the war in Gaza, oh, it's Netanyahu, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. No, it's the Jews. That's the end of the story. And the fact that we've been successful in the world and we've been able to build a country as a Jewish people and have success in that country, that's why they hate us. You know, like as Darrell Horn writes in their book, people love dead Jews. You know, when we're dead, they like us. But as long as we're alive and thriving and doing something successful, they can't stand us. And that is always the case. So it's always just ironic to point out that one of his biggest goals was to stop anti-Semitism. And almost everything else on the checklist he succeeded in or has come into fruition. But the one thing that's gotten 100 times worse is anti-Semitism in this world. How did he do it? How did he coalesce his ideas? How did he bring his ideas to fruition? Now, this was really his chiddush, his novel principle he was bringing. Because as we said, Rothschild hated the idea of political Zionism. He did not want a state and a flag and all this stuff. Chovei Tzion also, it wasn't part of their agenda. He was the first one to say, we got to have a state. Now, how does he bring about these ideas? Through his great skill, the pen. And he writes a book in 1896 called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, which he writes in German because that was the intellectual language of the time, but it was later translated into Hebrew, Yiddish, and many European languages. And the book, so to speak, takes the Jewish community by storm. Now, it makes many in the literary community think Herzl's lost his marbles, as we said before, but it takes the Jewish community by storm. Now, in this book, he was promoting this idea of a Jewish state with a flag, with an army. And he says in it, you know, Palestine would be a nice place for this, but it doesn't have to be Palestine. It could be Argentina, he says in the book. But you know, this is looked at really the beginning of the organization of his ideas of modern political Zionism. Now, he wrote several other books that are interesting to point out. I'm always fascinated by an essay he wrote in 1897 called The Menorah. Now, the reason I'm fascinated with this essay is because it shows that all of this work of Zionism, while it aroused in him, you know, this idea of having a state and political Zionism, and as we're going to see, everything that he did, it almost in many ways aroused in him that pinta yid, that pent-up Jewish spark that every Jew has inside of him. And that becomes evidently clear in this essay he wrote in 1897, The Menorah. He writes in that essay, the thought that there was only one way out of this Jewish suffering, namely to return to Judaism. In other words, he comes to the conclusion, kind of early in the process, 1897, that if we are going to bring the Jews out of their terrible predicament, it's not going to be through assimilation. It's not going to be through leaving Judaism. It's going to be through leaning into Judaism. A point that I agree with and say myself wholeheartedly quite often. Now, in 1902, he wrote another book called The Alt Nye Land, the New Old Land, the Old New Land, which was a visionary novel outlining how he saw the eventual Jewish state would play out. And he saw it as a pluralistic, egalitarian Jewish society, a place where everyone would be accepted, Jews, Arabs, non-Jews, everyone could come in, everyone would be treated equally, and bringing together the Jewish intellectia to the state, and building up this state would be great for all the Jews and the Arabs and everyone involved. Now, clearly in this book, he was already writing about it being Palestine. He was writing about it being Israel. And, you know, this idea was really an idea that the early Zionists grab onto. They said, of course, the peasant Arabs in Palestine will love what we're going to do. We're going to bring education and healthcare and jobs and all these wonderful things, all of which happened, by the way. But for some reason, the Arabs still hated the Jews. And if you go back to my Defending Israel series, we talk about this, how the Arab leadership on record regularly said, we'd rather live in our squalor and our backward society than have our society lifted up by the Jews. We want to do it ourselves, and if we're not going to do it ourselves, we don't want it, right? So again, just a crazy thought, but something that is historically very accurate. Okay, so he writes Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in 1896. What's next? He begins organizing, and he reaches out to all stripes of Jewish life, secular, socialist, religious, anyone who will listen. And he says we're all going to come together in a conference. So one thing about Herzl you got to give him credit for, in a time when things didn't move very quickly, because this is all long before the internet, you know, long before modern technology, you know, to get a message even from one end of Europe to the other could take some time. And in this time, very quickly, he gets his message out. And the book comes out in 1896. In 1897, he organizes the first Zionist Congress. And he invites everyone who could possibly be interested, any type of Jewish leader whatsoever, he invites to this Zionist Congress. Now, he had to come up with a name, right? Who came up with the name Zionism? We all call it now Zionism, and it's, you know, a dirty word in the United Nations, dirty word in so many places. But who came up with this movement that the Jews should have a state, that it should be called Zionism? So interesting to point out, it was a colleague, we'll say, of Herzl by the name of Nosson Birnbaum, who actually came up with it before Herzl comes on the scene. In 1890 already, Nosson Birnbaum coins the term Zionism because he said that it sparked the emotion of the Jewish people. Now, it's interesting to point out that Birnbaum himself will go away from the Zionist Zionist movement. He'll actually become a Baal Tshuva. In other words, he was secular, and then he became a religious Jew, and he becomes part of Agudas Yisrael, and really is against many of the things of the early Zionist movement, especially when it gets heavily taken over by secular ideology. So Herzl sends thousands of invitations to this first Zionist Congress around the Jewish world, and before he sends invitations, he had to find a place to host the Zionist Congress. There was only one problem. There was no hall in all of Europe that would rent to these Jews who wanted to have such a Congress. And he finally finds a casino in Basel, Switzerland, and that is where the first Zionist Congress is held. As a matter of fact, about a third of the Zionist Congress before the State of Israel will be held in Basel, Switzerland, because it's the only place that will allow the Jews or rent the Jews space to have such a Congress. So his genius is really that he's able to mobilize these diverse and even opposing factions in the Jewish world and bring them into one movement. Now, from the religious Jewish community, there was a split right at the beginning. And in part, the split was theological, that Zionism was a violation of Jewish tradition. Jewish tradition says we'll return to the state of Israel, we'll have a Jewish state when Mashiach comes. And this guy did not look like Mashiach. He did not look like the Messiah. There was nowhere, anywhere in like Jewish theology, Jewish philosophy, anywhere, that Mashiach, the Messiah, could be this secular Jew who was not observant of Jewish law. So like the whole thing was, it was very hard to wrap the heads around from a theological perspective. And even for many, just practically, especially talking about going back to Palestine. Palestine is controlled by the Turks at this time, and people feared the Turks. And many Jews lived under the Turkish Empire, lived under the Ottoman Empire, and they were afraid of what that meant. So there were many people who are going to oppose Herzl from the very beginning. The religious community, the Reform community will be heavily opposed to the Zionist movement until long after the State of Israel is founded. And so he has so many opposing forces from the beginning, yet he's still able to bring together hundreds of Jews at this first Zionist Congress in 1897, which is a feat unto itself that we can't minimize that. We can't minimize what he did, and organizing all these different factions and whoever didn't oppose him completely into some sort of a movement. And he wrote in his diary that at Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I say this out loud today, I would be greeted by universal laughter. In 5 years perhaps, and certainly in 50, everyone will perceive it. The Jewish state was founded 51 years after the first Zionist Congress. So almost prophetic words that he writes. So again, this is just part of the struggle of Herzl in understanding who he was. Completely not religious, but almost prophetic in a certain sense. Like how do you wrap your head around such an individual? Now, how did he believe practically that it was going to happen? He believed that this Jewish state would be part of one of the great empires of Europe. Because if you remember, we're living in a time where Europe is broken into a handful of empires. You have the British Empire, you have what's becoming the German Empire, you have the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. You got 5 empires that control the entirety of Eastern and Western Europe. And so he thought that this Jewish state would be part of one of these great empires. And to this end, he spent the next 8 years of his life lobbying all these different governments. So he wasn't only reaching out to his different factions of the Jewish world, he was lobbying all these different governments, trying to get them to agree to the idea of a Jewish state. He lobbied the British Parliament. He spoke in the Parliament. His argument there was a Jewish state would mean that the Jews would not immigrate to England, right? And this is a time where we saw 2.5 million Jews leaving Eastern Europe. He said, give us a Jewish state, they won't come to England. Otherwise, you're going to have to deal with us. That was the argument he made to the British. He tried to sell the idea to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who becomes the ruler of the German Empire that brought Germany into World War I. They actually met in the land of Israel. They met at Mikveh Yisrael, an agricultural school, and he tried to sell him on the idea. The Ottoman Sultan, Abdul Hamid II, who controlled Palestine at that time, he offered to buy it, right? He spoke the language of the Ottomans. The Ottomans were a very corrupt nation, a very corrupt empire, the sick man of Europe. He offered to buy Palestine from the Ottomans. And it seemed that they had a price, that they might have agreed to that. So Herzl and his interactions with Rothschild, as we mentioned in our lecture on Rothschild, the two did not get along. Rothschild did not agree with Herzl, but he tried to lobby Rothschild to pay the Ottomans price to buy Palestine from the Ottomans. Rothschild refused. And then in 1903, the British come along, I guess hearing Herzl's words of if we don't have a Jewish state, they're all going to want to come to England, and they were afraid of that. So they said, well, we don't control Palestine, but we control this province on the continent of Africa called Uganda. We'll give you Uganda. You can go to Uganda and you can build your Jewish state. 1903, this becomes known as the Uganda proposal. The British offered it, and Herzl said, quite simply, he said, if one of the great empires of Europe are offering a home, we have to at least take it seriously. We have to at least discuss it. We have to at least vote on it. We have to look into it and see if it's viable. Now, obviously, this became very controversial because a large part of the motivation for many of those involved in the Zionist movement was the idea of the return to Zion, the return to Israel. So what are you talking about Uganda, 1,000 miles away from Israel? Like most Jews only know Uganda today because later the whole Entebbe affair where Jews were taken hostage in Uganda and the great daring rescue of the IDF. But like Uganda, what are we going over there for? But Herzl said if the British are offering, we need to at least look into it. And he said we got to bring it to a vote. And we got to discuss it. And he made it very clear that if we don't take this seriously, I am out of here. So he brought it to a vote at the Zionist Congress in 1903. Interesting to point out, Mizrahi, the religious Zionist group, the religious Zionist movement, voted for it. Many of the secularists voted against it, kind of the opposite of how we think we would vote. And the night after the vote, now the vote passed narrowly, but the night after the vote, Herzl wanted to reach out to those who voted against it. And he tried to sell them on this. This is a temporary place. If we go to Uganda, it's temporary. We can't get to Palestine now. It's controlled by the Ottomans. The Ottomans aren't giving it to us. Let's go to Uganda now. We'll start to organize a state. And when Palestine becomes available, we'll move it to Palestine. That's what he said to the group to try and appease them. But to his friends, he says, quite simply, it's clear they're not getting Palestine. By this time next year, we either have Uganda or I am done. That's what he told his friend. Now, it's interesting that this is only 7 years into the movement. It hasn't been going on for so long. And again, this is a long time ago when 7 years was actually a lot of time. Nowadays, 7 years is eons. But back then, 7 years wasn't that long. But he said straight out, it's clear we're not getting Palestine. We have an offer. Either that becomes a Jewish state or I am done. And again, in almost prophetic words, Herzl dies in 1904 before the next Zionist Congress. Again, you got to wonder what kind of guy this was. He dies in 1904 of heart failure after, in many ways, a tragic life, because here he gave everything he had for 8 years to the Zionist movement. Whatever fortune he had, he spent on it. He dies penniless, and the Zionist movement actually is going to raise money to support his widow and his 3 children because they're left with nothing, because everything that Herzl had in these 8 years, he puts into this movement. Now, there's mass mourning in many areas of the Jewish world, in any of the areas affected by or inspired by the Zionist movement. There's mass mourning. There's actually a fascinating story told about in the city of Brisk, the great city of Brisk, that the Brisker Rav was not into the idea of Zionism, and he did not want Herzl to be eulogized in the synagogue. So a man by the name of Binyamin Begin broke into the synagogue to eulogize Herzl after he passed away. Binyamin Begin was the father of Menachem Begin. So Menachem Begin later met with Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik in New York, the grandson of the Brisker Rav, and he talked about the story about how your grandfather wouldn't let my father give a eulogy in the shul, so he had to break into the shul to give this eulogy for Herzl. One of those fascinating stories. But it was a tragic life in many ways, because he died broken at 44. His family was broken. We're going to see all of his children die young, and there's almost nothing left of Herzl today as far as descendants of his family. Now, first of all, what happens to the Zionist movement after Herzl's passing? Initially, it remains in the hands of Western Europe. A man by the name of Max Nordau, who himself is a completely secular Jew, in fact, he's intermarried, he becomes the head of the Zionist movement. So it briefly stays in the control of Western Europe, but it very quickly falls into the hands of the Eastern European Jewish community, who are mainly socialist. Coast. And they become the ones who really form this idea of the Zionist movement, as we'll talk in later lectures of many of the people who will really formulate this idea of Herzl into a real state. When we talk about Chaim Weizmann, when we talk about David Ben-Gurion, they're Eastern, they're Russian European Jews who have socialistic ideas, and that's going to come in and in many ways take over the Zionist movement, even though that's not necessarily what Herzl thought and what Herzl thought the state would look like. So I'll leave it to you to decide if Herzl was the founder, if he is deserving of the accolade that he's given as the founder of the Zionist movement. In my opinion, he is, because he's the one who organizes all these things very, very quickly for his time and lays a foundation that'll later be built upon that will for sure become the Jewish state. I thank you so much for joining us tonight. I thank you so much for listening. And our next lecture, we will discuss Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of what we call revisionist Zionism. And I look forward to doing it together with you.